So I'm honored to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Susan Kavaler-Adler. And Dr. Kavaler-Adler is a clinical psychologist and psychoanalyst with over 45 years of experience. She's the founder and executive director of the Object Relations Institute for Psychotherapy and Psychoanalysis and a recognized leader in the field of object relations theory. Beyond her clinical practice, Dr. Kavaler-Adler leads innovative writing groups and experiential supervision groups that integrate depth psychology and creative exploration. And she also authored numerous books and articles and won many awards for her works. Today, she'll be speaking on a powerful and timely topic: courageous women cross the divide, Liz Cheney and Cassidy Hutchinson, and the role of the father and father figures. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Susan Kavaler-Adler. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you. Just 1 second, I have to close the door. Okay, hello everyone. Yes, courageous women cross the divide. Liz Cheney and Cassidy Hutchinson, the role of the father and father figures. What inspires and fortifies truth tellers in the face of tyranny? After the violent 2020 insurrection, through the work of the January 6th committee, we see the heroic efforts of two women who crossed the divide from Donald Trump and his MAGA Republican Party to tell truth to power. These two women sought the truth through an investigation of the destruction of America's Capitol, which was perpetrated along with the murderous assaults on the Capitol Police. Despite tremendous opposition in the form of social media lies and misinformation and plots of seditious conspiracy, and in prolific lies on Fox News and other right-wing media, as confirmed in the Dominion lawsuit against Fox News, a House of Representatives Congressional Special Committee investigation proceeded under the auspices of Chairman Benny Thompson and Congresswoman Liz Cheney. During this investigation, Liz Cheney, a middle-aged woman with a law degree and 5 children, who is fighting to save our country and its Constitution, met Cassidy Hutchinson, a young woman who courageously testified as a main witness for the January 6th committee. Cassidy Hutchinson was 26 when she testified, and she had been 24 and 25 working in the White House. From 2019 to 2020, Liz Cheney was in the House Republican Conference Leadership Group, becoming the leader of that conference, while Cassidy Hutchinson had been working at her second paid job in the White House. Cassidy Hutchinson had been working at the Office of Legislative Affairs, where she had become the chief aide to Mark Meadows, the Trump-appointed chief of staff. As one of the many Republicans called by subpoena to testify before the committee, Cassidy Hutchinson was the most critical witness. In fact, she had been the closest upfront observer of all that had gone on in the offices akin to the president's office on January 6th. She had also witnessed all the nefarious activities of her boss, Mark Meadows, in months and weeks leading up to the January 6th violent insurrection riot. She had seen Meadows burning barrels of official government papers to the point that his wife was compelled to stop him because he was constantly leaking fumes from his shirt and clothing, reeking of the smoke of his own fires. Cassidy Hutchinson had also observed Mark Meadows' total indifferent and negligent failure to intercede with Donald Trump when the president refused for over 3 hours to say anything to stop the riot, to stop the Trump-supporting bloody mob from violently entering and ransacking the United States Capitol. Trump and Mark Meadows failed to stop the violent invasion and destruction of the Capitol, called the People's House, even after the federal presidential office attorney, Pat Cipollone, had declared with enraged concern right to the face of Mark Meadows, "If you don't tell the president to stop this, there will be blood on your hands." Cipollone shouted this at Meadows while all the rioters violently entered the Capitol building and began their vicious attacks on the Capitol Police. He shouted this at Meadows in front of Cassidy Hutchinson while the invading crowd entered the Capitol building and attempted to violate the inner sanctum of official government activity. Cassidy Hutchinson was a witness to all of this. In fact, Cipollone came individually to her and begged her to do something. Cassidy Hutchinson had vivid memories of all that day's tragic dramas while being impotent to do anything. The only person who could stop it, Donald Trump, refused to act for over 3 hours. In fact, Trump had been instigating the whole thing for months. It was over 3 hours until Trump finally told the rioters inside and outside the Capitol to go home. And even then, he excused them and told them they were very special. Cassidy knew and remembered all the details of that January 6th day, which had played out right in front of her. Her testimony could lead to the discovery of Trump's premeditated plans for a government overthrow, a planned coup. The seditious conspiracy of Trump in setting up fake electors, the crimes that he directed the corrupt attorney John Eastman to do, and as many of you may know, John Eastman took the Fifth Amendment 125 times when he was subpoenaed. And the violent intrigues of Trump in conjunction with the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, all these premeditated plots, which only failed due to Pence's decision to hold to his constitutional role in the confirmation of the presidential vote proceedings, all this was behind the scenes that led up to the critical January 6th day, which Cassidy Hutchinson viewed from her front row perch near the Oval Office. When Cassidy Hutchinson was first subpoenaed to present her knowledge to the January 6th committee, she was terrified because she assumed she would need an attorney to help her, and she had absolutely no money to employ one. In desperation, she went to employ her father to help her. Following my reading of Cassidy Hutchinson's memoir, Enough, I wrote about a scene between her and her father in an article of mine on father-disillusionment in courageous women, which is in the Journal of Psychohistory in 2025 from last year's conference. In this poignant and painful dramatic scene, Cassidy begs her father to lend her money, for which she says she will pay him back with a larger amount of interest she would have paid to a bank. Not only did her father refuse and tell her to be loyal to Trump, but he bullied, belittled, and mocked her as she lay on the floor crying helplessly in despair and torment. Cassidy's father also accused her of causing his financial problems, as he had had to pay child support to her mother during her childhood after her mother divorced her father. Yet as Cassidy left her father's home, her father wanted her to tell him she loved him. His sadistic torment came to this culmination, leaving Cassidy feeling skeptical about her father's capacity to love. She felt alone. She did not know where to turn for legal help, and she feared being asked to testify. So how did this encounter with her father, after her tremendous disillusionment with Donald Trump, lead up to her courageous truth-telling and to her profound connection with Liz Cheney? Without any resources, Cassidy Hutchinson was at first forced to hire an attorney who was part of the Trump world cult. With a Trump attorney, Cassidy was coerced into giving minimal information. She was also coerced into claiming that she couldn't recall things that she absolutely recalled in vivid 26-year-old memory detail. Cassidy Hutchinson detested being reined in and restrained in this way. She had so much to tell, and she wanted to tell it. When she met Liz Cheney at her first private interview, she did give the impression of wanting to tell more than she was telling. I would assume she showed this non-verbally as well as verbally. Liz Cheney was conducting this first private interview, and Liz said that she might like to invite her back for another interview. However, the Trump attorney did not want Cassidy to speak further before the committee. He tried to discourage her from doing so. Nevertheless, Cassidy had at this point met Liz Cheney, and she wanted very much to open to Liz and her committee as she experienced Liz Cheney's deep-rooted aspiration to attain the truth and to fulfill the mission of her investigation. Consequently, Cassidy told Liz that she would like to tell more than she had been able to expose with the Trump attorney. She made it clear that she needed an attorney who was independent of the Trump circle. Liz Cheney told her that she herself could not be involved in the selection of the attorney as she needed to maintain her neutral role, but Cheney did manage to introduce her to those who could refer her to pro bono counsel. Cassidy was told by one of the committee's members that a young woman in her 20s who had no years of savings or investments and who was currently out of a job since she had worked for Mark Meadows and thus for Trump, and she could not be expected to pay huge attorney's fees just because she had been subpoenaed to testify. This person, and maybe others, led her to two pro bono attorneys who were willing to take her on. One was a woman and one a man. They both became extremely supportive figures in the rest of Cassidy Hutchinson's journey of witness testimony. Liz Cheney's job was not only difficult in terms of the actual planning of the daily program of the committee, as witnesses were arranged and called, along with those who trusted to help her, but she also was under tremendous pressure, as she notes in her memoir, Oath and Honor. This is Liz Cheney's memoir. Oath and Honor, to try to minimize the intrusion of the press. Consequently, when reporters were gathered in one area of the public building where testimony was taking place, Liz Cheney and her colleagues arranged to have Cassidy Hutchinson do her interview for testimony in a small basement room with a tiny table. This is where Cassidy Hutchinson greeted the world. It was behind this petite table in an obscure room that Cassidy Hutchinson sat tall and proud while she answered every question posed to her in generous and vivid and exacting detail. In her memoir, Enough, Cassidy Hutchinson speaks of how she trained herself to sit up tall and to speak loudly and clearly. Once she was in the main committee testimony after her initial interview, she was before the monumental camera of the world. Millions watched her on television. Then, to encourage her own resolve to tell the truth when in the face of government power, Cassidy Hutchinson researched and found Alex Butterfield. Alex Butterfield is the man who had spoken truth to power during the Watergate hearings. Just like Cassidy Hutchinson in the current moment, Alex Butterfield had been the key witness at a time of government and constitutional crisis. Alex Butterfield was the deputy assistant to President Nixon from 1969 to 1973. He was pivotal in exposing Nixon and bringing him to his forced resignation. It was Alex Butterfield who could offer firsthand testimony to Congress about the fact that Nixon had taped all of the White House meetings. In the silent pause before Alex Butterfield answered, the world was waiting in suspense. Then Alex Butterfield spoke, and suddenly the case was made, the case to impeach. All he had to say was yes, and he said yes, there were tapes. Suddenly the case was made, the case to impeach and convict an American president. As I said, all he had to say was yes, and he said yes, there are tapes. It was in such congressional testimony that the world learned through Alex Butterfield that Nixon had taped all his White House conversations. This then led others to subpoena the recordings. It was after other aides told Nixon to release one specific tape to the public that Nixon resigned. But of course, it took a Supreme Court decision that ordered Nixon to turn over the subpoenaed tapes. Cassidy Hutchinson found Alex Butterfield, and he found her. Alex was as impressed with Cassidy as she with him. He was impressed with her willingness to play a pivotal role of testimony in a case that challenged a president, just as she was impressed with his courageous act of truth-telling in the face of government power. Cassidy found Alex Butterfield when she was seeking the kind of older male figure support that she had been totally unable to find with her father. Alex Butterfield became the male mentor who could psychologically serve as Cassidy Hutchinson's substitute male father figure. Her memoir ends with a picture of a warm embrace between her and Alex Butterfield. The picture is a fitting epilogue for Cassidy's memoir, Enough. Like all women, Cassidy Hutchinson would greatly benefit from a male father figure who she could admire. Although her mother's second husband was a friend, he did not serve her as a father figure. She needed a father figure to admire, and in this way she was bereft. She had been bereft of such a father figure in relation to two older men whom she had worked for, Trump and Mark Meadows, and very much in relation to her own father. However, in her early childhood, she had been close to her father. She must have wanted to admire him as she perhaps did when she was a little girl. Yet she came to see her father's faults all too prominently, was still a child, and then as a teenager, and finally as a very disillusioned adult, as her father failed to respond to a desperate cry for help at a critical time, and also an earlier critical time when her life was medically in danger. Perhaps her ability to seek out Butterfield and to experience a long-needed father figure admiration was due not only to her having a good mother, but was also related to her early bond with her biological father. It is interesting to see Cassidy Hutchinson and Liz Cheney come together in their patriotic risk-taking despite the contrast in the fathers who influenced them. The poignant moment between Cassidy and Liz. In her 2023 memoir, Oath and Honor, Liz Cheney describes a very personal encounter between herself and Cassidy Hutchinson. This moment came after Cassidy had risked all to tell the truth to the January 6th committee about Donald Trump and Mark Meadows. As the meetings were closing, at the same time as Liz Cheney hugged and shook the hands of Shaye Moss and her mother, Ruby Freeman, who had been so brutally defamed by Giuliani during the 2020 election debacles, she has some tender moments with Cassidy Hutchinson, the most critical witness on the January 6th committee. Cheney writes in her memoir, Oath and Honor, as Cassidy, quote, as Cassidy and her lawyer were leaving, she paused and turned back to me. I gave her a hug and I thanked her. I want you to know, I said, that I have 3 daughters who are about your age. If they ever had to face what you have, I can only hope they would show the same courage you have. Tears welled in her eyes. It was obvious that Cassidy was under tremendous stress. It was equally obvious that she was determined to do what was right. Their eyes had met and a deep bond of recognition of one another took place. The older woman, with a lifetime of public service and public relations experience, spoke so revealingly, and perhaps even intimately, to the younger woman, the woman who was the age of her young daughters. They were both so moved, and Cassidy Hutchinson's tears spoke of how she had been emotionally touched, as she had been physically embraced by Alex Butterfield. The sharing of courage was evident and brought them close. Cassidy was being admired for her courage by a woman who was to be awarded the John F. Kennedy Profile in Courage Award in 2022. They shared courage and risk-taking, but Cassidy was a young ingenue, while Liz Cheney was an established and publicly experienced stateswoman. Cassidy spoke wisely and calmly during the hearings, as if decades older. She had no interruptions in her eyewitness account of what she had observed by any political thoughts, lines, or innuendo. She simply spoke of what she had seen and heard, and the drama was all in that of which she told. The drama was in the life and death meaning for the Constitution of the United States. Cassidy would later speak of her concern for democracy in TV interviews, for example, on MSNBC with Lawrence O'Donnell and Rachel Maddow. She spoke of how she had formerly been a Republican because of Ronald Reagan, and had voted for Trump in 2020, but after Trump's role in the January 6th riots, she stated in interviews that she is planning to vote for Joseph Biden in 2024. She stated it was only Biden and the Democrats at that point who were committed to preserve democracy and to preserve personal character in political elections. Cheney would later support Kamala Harris for the same reasons. They both crossed party lines to save and serve the United States of America. The role of the father for female courage as for female creativity. What role does the father play in the success of his daughter? In 1982 and 1989, Laura Himes Tessman addressed this question in two articles that fashioned an empirically based theory on endeavor excitement. The first article, a chapter in an edited book, is entitled A Note on the Father's Contribution to a Daughter's Ways of Loving and Working. The second article is called Early Tones, Later Echoes, also in the same edited book. Beyond the classical psychoanalytic focus on Oedipal romance excitement of a daughter in relation to her father, we can look at a broader level of excitement that motivates creativity, intellectual development and belief, and ultimately courage. Laura Himes Tessman's conception of endeavor excitement speaks of this psychodynamic form of female energy, the early tones being father and daughter determining the later echoes in the woman's performances and accomplishments in the world. In 1988, I published a chapter in an edited book entitled Psychophysical Passages in the Life of Women. I called the chapter The Father's Role in the Self-Development of His Daughter. In this article, I spoke of how the father can support the growth of his daughter's self-expressive creativity in each developmental stage as she travels from different stages of childhood through adolescence. The father can support his daughter's development towards having a unique and vocal voice in the world. Tessman's idea of endeavor excitement seems to overlap with my own view of how female growth is energized through her father's focus on her, mirroring as part of it, but not all, and through his interactive engagement with her. Given our consensus on the powerful impact of the father on his daughter's manifest voice in the world as the daughter navigates through adulthood, let's now look at the unique and powerful courage in both Liz Cheney and Cassidy Hutchinson. Liz Cheney and her father, Dick or Richard Cheney. On the day when Democrats in Congress were all voting for the second impeachment of Donald Trump, Dick Cheney accompanied his daughter. He was not at that time in any official public office, yet he was there to show his support for his daughter and to stop the future damage that Donald Trump could do to our democracy if he was able to run again for the American presidency. The Democrats found it strange company to be in when the man they had called Dark Vader during the vice presidency in the George W. Bush White House, due to his continued support for the Iraq War, appeared before them as an ally. Other than Adam Kissinger, there were no other Republicans besides Dick Cheney appearing at the time of the vote that day to convict Trump on impeachment. However, Dick Cheney was there to support his daughter Liz and to support her standing up for the American Constitution, which had been significantly violated on January 6, 2020, and on the days before and after January 6, when Trump and his lies on social media and Fox News to deny the loss of the presidential election to Joseph Biden. In her memoir book, Oath and Honor, a Memoir and a Warning, Liz Cheney has various memories of her father showing his solid and sustained support for her. He also openly expressed his pride in her as she proceeded to organize the ongoing process of the January 6th committee. Dick Cheney openly declared on television that he and his wife were so proud of Liz. Also, he worried about Liz's safety during the horrors of the violent attack on the Congress and the Capitol on January 6th. When Liz Cheney repeatedly spoke out against Trump and for democracy, Dick Cheney was in the background, expressively calling her fearless, quote, fearless. Dick Cheney, as well as many others, seemed to be greatly impressed that Liz Cheney not only voted for Trump's impeachment when she had formally supported him before January 6th, but she also risked her own political future. In her own words, Liz Cheney repeatedly chose to, quote, to put country over party, to put country over party. On the fateful day in Wyoming when Liz Cheney ran for re-election as a House Republican Congresswoman and lost her 73% pass voting success margin to her opposition because of her refusal to lie for Trump about the 2020 election, Dick Cheney was there cheering her on. Dick Cheney had heard Liz Cheney speak out for democracy and honesty in relation to the lies and travesties of January 6th. He may not always have been sure she should risk it, but she always did. Thus, he saw her as fearless. First, there was a day Liz Cheney was told to step down as the leader of the Congressional House Republican Conference. She spoke out that day about how she would not join those who lied about the violent insurrection on January 6th and about democracy. She then spoke about the freedoms and rights provided by the Constitution and of how Trump had violated the Constitution. Sometimes she would quote Abraham Lincoln in his passion to preserve the U.S. Republic in the face of the violent opposition of the Southern slave states. Sometimes she would refer to Benjamin Franklin, who famously said that his Congress was establishing a republic if you can keep it. With all her commitments to the January 6th committee as its vice chair and speaking out in general about the election denial that was threatening the peaceful transition of power and the Constitution that supported that transition of power peacefully, Liz Cheney had little time to campaign to keep her congressional House seat for Wyoming. Nevertheless, she risked the election further by speaking out right before the vote. Liz Cheney had little time. At that point, she made a substantial statement about election integrity versus election denialism and about our American foundation in election honesty and in the rule of law. Liz Cheney went on to massively lose this election, which she had then expected to lose, despite the 73% lead she would have had if she had not spoken out. Dick Cheney was in the background admiring her and calling her fearless while he still worried about her safety. He went on to support her campaigning for Kamala Harris against Donald Trump in the 2024 presidential election, admitting that he, Dick Cheney, like Liz herself, disagreed with the policies of Biden, Harris, and the Democrats, but that he also, like Liz, was putting country over party. Dick Cheney took a public stand to support and vote for Kamala Harris, even as his former boss, George W. Bush, remained silent. Dick Cheney was supporting Liz throughout her life, but in these later years, as she risked all her political capital to speak up for what she believed, he was inspired by his daughter. Her energy and courage may have grown out of the kind of endeavor excitement that her daughter gained through her father's regard for her. But the mutuality of courage and belief manifested between the father and daughter later. In fact, Dick Cheney had modeled courage for his oldest daughter, Liz, in his willingness to speak out openly about his convictions that involve supporting very controversial positions. The People magazine interview. Although Liz Cheney commented briefly in her book about her father's support, she is more revealing about her relationship with her father in a People magazine article. When asked by the People magazine reporter, "What advice does your father give you?" she said, "He's just been steadfast, and I think he's also given me a lot of strength. Obviously, I have been a member of the Republican Party for decades. He had been for even longer. His advice, his thoughts, his views about what's required at this moment has certainly given me strength and has been a real example for me." When asked if her father worried about her, Liz Cheney said, certainly he worries about security. And on January 6th, he was the one who called me to tell me that Trump had said, quote, we have to get rid of the Liz Cheneys of the world on that day. And I was getting ready to give a speech on the floor of the House explaining why we couldn't object to the electoral votes. And my dad called me to say, quote, look, they have put you in danger. And we had a discussion about whether I should give my speech. And I decided I had to. There was no way I could not go forward because of a threat of violence. The People magazine interviewer asked Liz Cheney if she had any regrets. She responded, no, for me, there's no House seat that is worth violating your office to the Constitution for, or accepting the kind of behavior that we saw from Donald Trump leading up to and on the 6th. And so it's never really seemed to me like there was a choice because it was so clear what was required. In keeping with her sentiments in the interview and in her book, which all agreed with and supported by her father, Liz Cheney dedicates her book to her 5 children, quote, with the hope that they will live in freedom, close quote. And Liz Cheney continues as she speaks to People magazine in relation to her children and in relation to the future for America, quote, and it's so sad that we're at a moment that you even have to question that possibility. She continues that for her, happiness is having leaders who believe in American democracy and in the goodness of America. For Liz, her father, Dick Cheney, was such a leader who she could model her own truth speaking on. Conclusion: courage, honesty, and father-daughter inspiration, 2 contrasting women. In many respects, Liz Cheney and Cassidy Hutchinson had contrasting lives and backgrounds. Liz Cheney came from a financially secure background with a whole history of public service in her family, such history described in detail in her memoir, and with generations of devotion to the building of American democracy and with a famous vice president father. She worked for what she had achieved within the context of such a family and gained full support from her family and especially from her father. She always felt the support that was behind her, but when the time of risk-taking came for her, she was ready to speak truth to power as a unique voice, the voice of one mature female individual. She spoke about her truth and spoke public truth, which immediately threatened her with losing elections and with being a public target, possibly bringing personal danger. Cassidy Hutchinson, by contrast, is from a humbler background, with a father who had a small trucking business and a mother who set up a small shop to earn a living after her choice to divorce her first husband. Cassidy's father. Right out of college, Cassidy Hutchinson was able to advance in public service to a very important government position, right out of college, as the chief aide to the president's chief of staff, Mark Meadows. Her intellect, intuition, and instincts became quite evident while she was at a very young age in her early 20s. She spoke truth to power on the January 6th committee. With the aid of pro bono attorneys and the protection of Liz Cheney's arrangements for where and when she would be asked to testify for the January 6th committee, Cassidy Hutchinson rose to the occasion of revealing to the world the moment-to-moment details of the egregious indifference, cruelty, and neglect of Donald Trump and his chief of staff, Mark Meadows, on the infamous January 6th day. Once Cassidy Hutchinson spoke up in congressional testimony against her boss, Mark Meadows. Mark Meadows removed her as his aide and excused his actions by saying he had been told to get rid of her by Donald Trump, who began to view Hutchinson as disloyal. Later, he snubbed her in a restaurant, Mark Meadows, and would not speak to her. This seems to have been the cowardly behavior of the senior male officials who ducked giving any testimony before the January 6th committee, while the young ingenue woman, Cassidy Hutchinson, volunteered volumes of detailed testimony. Both brave women, Cassidy Hutchinson and Liz Cheney, seem to have had good mothers, but their inspiration to engage with public service and with exposing public corruption seems to have also related to a kind of energy that can be called endeavor excitement, a la Testament, and which relates to the influence of father and father figures at various developmental stages, as I wrote about in 1988. Cassidy Hutchinson had a close relationship with her father when a child. So even though her father failed to be someone who could support her or even understand her as she grew to adulthood, engaged with the world at a level her father could not comprehend, she seems to have had enough energy from the father-daughter relationship to later on seek out a male mentor who was at the level of public truth-speaking that she had risen to, Alex Butterfield. She also had the courage to face profound disillusionment with the significant older male figures, particularly with Donald Trump and to some extent with Mark Meadows. In books I have written about distinguished female writers and artists, one can also see the role of the father in the development of a daughter, as well as in the painful disillusionment of the daughter as she moves forward in courageous self-expression in her adult life. Studies of Virginia Woolf, Camille Claudel, and Catherine Mansfield cases in point in The Creative Mystique from Red Shoes Frenzy to Loving Creativity in 1996 and then republished in 2014, as are Emily Bronte, Charlotte Bronte, and Emily Dickinson in The Compulsion to Create, Women Writers and Their Demon Lovers, and also in 1993 and then 2013. I also have many studies in these books and in other books and articles on the demon lover complex, which relates to demonization of a failed father and how this affects both courageous creative self-expression and suicidal despair. The study of Anne Sexton in The Creative Mystique is a case in point of this syndrome, which highlights the negative side of the power of the father with his daughter, which is a contrast to the incredible resilience and self-fulfillment of the two courageous women studied here. Thank you. And I have my references on the next page. Okay.
Thank you very much, Susan. Thanks a lot. Really, thanks a lot.